Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. You know, the House Republicans have been doing an amazing job despite all the news media, all of the gloom and doom. The National Republican Congressional Committee delivered the strongest first quarter in its history, hauling in $47.1 million, which beat the best previous March when the committee recorded $28 million. So think about that. They've jumped from 28 to 47 million. And I'll tell you, as the Speaker of the House, who once had to go out and raise this money, that is an amount I could not have dreamed of. I think that the chairman, Congressman Richard Hudson, in a statement said, quote, "This historic fundraising quarter proves House Republicans have a tremendous amount of enthusiasm behind our agenda to lower costs and keep Americans safe. House Republicans are united, battle-tested, and building the financial firepower to protect our majority and take the fight directly to the Democrats' extreme agenda." Close quote. I think that Congressman Hudson's onto something. So I'm more optimistic about keeping the House and increasing the Senate than most of the folks you'll see on television. The second thing, though, is really, frankly, surprising. Air Canada is suspending certain U.S. flights because of fuel prices. People tend to forget that aviation fuel is one of the highest costs that an airline has to pay for. When you deal with that, the jet fuel prices increased more than 50% since February 27th. So the war in Iran has had a huge impact on the cost of aviation or commercial airlines. I think Air Canada has decided they were going to take their least profitable routes and not fly them until aviation fuel became more available. Coming up, I'm joined by New York Times bestselling author and Pulitzer Prize finalist, Dr. Arthur Herman. He's a great guy, and we're going to discuss his new book, Founders Fire, from 1776 to the Age of Trump. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, New York Times bestselling author and Pulitzer Prize finalist, Dr. Arthur Herman. His new book, Founders Fire, from 1776 to the Age of Trump, is available now. It's great that you would join me. As you know, I'm a big fan of your work. You wrote that the future depends on this new generation of founders. What does that actually mean? I mean, we're on our 250th anniversary, and what would a new generation of founders be like?
The new generation of founders, what I'm talking about is we hear a lot of criticism and criticism sometimes bordering on despair about our Gen Z and about their predecessors in Gen Y and Gen X. I don't know how many predecessors there are, and that they lack the kind of commitment and that they lack a knowledge of American history and of American culture. You and I have talked about this several times, about those elements. But what I see as being important, why I'm optimistic about the future, is because what I see is this very core characteristic, something which, as my book explains, really lies at the core of American history, of American exceptionalism, what we call American exceptionalism, is this belief, this self-belief that one can go out and build and create your own enterprise, whether it's a business enterprise, whether it's a new institution, even a new charity, creating something from nothing, which becomes a springboard to success for yourself, but also for others as well. Now, we see this mostly, and the term founder is really used very much today in business circles, in talking about a certain kind of personality, a certain breed of entrepreneur who's willing to take the risk to plunge in and to create a new business, a new enterprise, and to see it through, to achieve a vision of where they believe the future can go and what their place is in that. And that's certainly a big driving factor in a lot of the success that American business has had over our 250 years. And a lot of the book is about the success of those founders. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, But it's also important to realize this is not just for extraordinary human beings, this ability to plunge into the unknown, to venture into new places and take new directions. It's something which I think permeates throughout American culture. It's one of the things, Newt, that I think also draws the best immigrants to this country as well, is the chance to start anew, start afresh, create your own future and create your own, whether it's your own business, whether it's your own enterprise. This is part of what I believe, this is part of the gift that our original founding fathers gave to us, is the mechanisms, the structure that we need in the United States to achieve this kind of individualized drive and success. You know, Calvin Coolidge, right, famously said, America's business is business. And I think this book helps us to understand why that is and why it is that America is and remains really the hub of innovative, creative, successful businesses in the way in which in other countries, in other continents, we just don't see that kind of instinct, that kind of push coming forward.
I mean, it seems to me that we have a passion for creativity, almost in the sense that Schumpeter, who talked about creative destruction and said, you had to be tearing down the past if you're going to build the future. It's remarkable in the American system how you have this constant surge of new energy, new ideas, new opportunities.
It's a self-renewal process. And I think we're seeing that now. And that's also part of the experience of American history, is that the founding principles, the ones that are laid out in the Declaration and the Constitution, aren't just set in a lapidary sense, they're constantly being renewed. They're constantly being brought into the breadth of American experience and changes. And I talk about figures, not just in American business, but Abraham Lincoln, for example. I have a chapter on Lincoln. As a founder personality, is that kind of desire to see the American principles of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that needed to be renewed and willing to fight a monstrous and bloody civil war in order to achieve that and abolish slavery. And I have a chapter on Martin Luther King, who also saw an opportunity here to have that refounding of American principles through the civil rights movement, that equality should not just be a matter of legal status of being free or unfree, but that it includes so much more, to move from second-class citizenship for African Americans, for blacks to achieve an equality of citizenship with Americans in that regard. And in the course of American business, we see this as well, don't we? Where we have a highly successful founder who creates a business which grows and expands. And as it grows and builds, it loses some of that original fire, some of that original vision and drive that got the founder off and running successfully in the first place. And the business begins to slow. It begins to stagnate. People begin to look as a way to protect their own paychecks and look ahead to the next shareholders meeting, the next quarterly statement. And then someone comes along over from the other side, from a different direction, and says, I've got a better idea. I've got a way in which to build this. The great example of this, Newt, I talk about him in the book, in my chapter on the tech industry, is Steve Jobs and his competition with IBM. IBM was this giant in the computer industry. Everybody thought, well, the best way you can deal with IBM is to adapt to its rules and adapt to its business model and how you fit in with that. But Jobs deliberately chose to create a company, Apple, which was the antithesis of everything that IBM stood for. And everybody's surprise and shock, except his, he managed to create an enormously successful company that forced IBM to rethink their business plan and to sort of say, if we're going to survive in this world of computers and the tech industry, we've got to rethink what our role will be. Because at this rate, we're going to dwindle and we'll go the route of A&P, T Company, will be one of those great giant companies that was great once and is now faded into history.
Let's go back to just for a second to Lincoln, because I'm permanently enthralled by him. In 1832, he runs for the legislature for the first time at the age of 23. He has read in an article that a railroad engine has arrived from Britain. It landed in Baltimore in 1831. He's never seen one, but part of his platform is that they need railroads in Illinois in order to get farmers to market. By 1859, he is a very successful railroad lawyer. He is the only American president to hold a patent.
Yes, he is. That's right.
So, and he had patented a device to turn over a steamboat if it had capsized. And he'd won an enormously important case involving a bridge, a railroad bridge, that was hit by a steamboat. And he proved that the steamboat captain was drunk and that therefore it was not the railroad's fault. And that was important because if the principle had been established, the railroads were responsible for the right-of-way of ships, you'd have had a totally different economics. Finally, in 1859, he stands in Council Bluffs, Iowa, looking across the Missouri and says, we need a transcontinental railroad to tie the nation together. Now, if you think about that, here's a guy who's instinctively, his entire career, tied to technology and to business success.
And with that vision, and with the ability to have that kind of wide vision that is going to drive him both as a lawyer in terms of his work with the railroads, but then also as a president. That's really fascinating. In the end, I think we talk about our founding fathers and we use the term founders to describe them because of their drive, their vision, their willingness to risk everything. I mean, what were the chances that they were going to be able to beat the greatest empire on earth in order to achieve the independence? The odds were running totally against them in that regard. But it isn't just a one-off thing. This is one of the things I stress in the book, Newt. It wasn't a one-off founding in many ways, because what the founding fathers did was to leave us with gifts. And I think there are 3 or even 4 gifts they left for us that inspire and help to ignite that freedom's fire today. One of those gifts was presidential power in the U.S. Constitution. As you know, there was a great debate about how much power one could entrust to a single individual under the new Constitution. The Articles of Confederation had almost none, had left almost nothing to a single individual because they didn't want another King George. That was the key reason for it. But Hamilton and Jefferson, and particularly Hamilton, argued that this new Constitution, you needed an office in which there would be this energy, this ability to take bold action, executive power here. And that Constitution has given that as a powerful gift for our presidents going forward, including the present one. And as you know, that gift of executive power is one that is highly controversial, has always aroused enmity and envy on the part of Congresses, on the part of commentators. We're seeing that played out today with the attacks on President Trump that goes with it. The second gift I'll mention, we want to come back to Trump, but the second gift I want to mention touches on just what you said, and that is the creation of the Patent Office. The creation of the Patent Office as part of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that protects the right of individuals, of inventors, to own their own inventions and creative patents here. In fact, as I point out in the book, it's the only place in the U.S. Constitution outside of the Bill of Rights that actually uses the word right to describe that. And what that does is to empower individuals to take their creations, their inventions, their technologies, and to use them as they see fit, whether it's to make money, whether it's to improve conditions in infrastructure or in their community. The right is with them to make that decision, and they're free to make that decision about when they think the moment is right to bring it to market, to bring it to the public here. And that's hugely important. And this is what unleashes what Lincoln called the fire of genius in the American culture and American mind that the Patent Office sets up and allows to happen. And that has been something that our founding fathers saw as essential to the American experience, the American experiment in liberty. And it's one that I think is in many ways so unique to why America has this ability to create new technologies, new inventions, new businesses and enterprises in the way in which the founding fathers envisioned would take place.
You know, you have this, I think, brilliant insight that founder is a non-historic thing. It's not just, the people in 1776, but founder is a process built into American culture and which has in many ways defined us. And then I found it very impressive. You lay out 6 traits that you think are sort of the core of being a founder. Could you walk us through that? I think you did a great job and a very important job in describing them.
Oh, thank you. One of those characteristics is a bias towards action. In other words, the founder mindset is one when it sees a problem, when it sees an issue, it sees an opportunity, it is to immediately move forward in that direction. A bias towards action in order to solve problems, not just talk about them and discuss them. And again, it's one of the things that often arouses a lot of opposition. And one of the things that I stress in the book is you have this powerful action-oriented founder instinct and founder mindset, but you also have its opposite in those who find that kind of bias towards action very threatening or too risky from their point of view. And that's the second aspect of the founder's mindset, is this willingness to take on risks. And take on risks not in a careless or in a gambling sense, but drawing upon one's own experience and one's own experience with, let's say, failure in the past, and realizing, you know what, the opportunity in this case outweighs the risks that go with it. Even to the point, as founders like our own founding fathers did in 1776, of being willing to risk everything because the goal that you set in mind, the goal you have, is so important that you're willing to put to risk everything else in order to achieve that distinction. Another key characteristic of founders throughout American history, throughout history, also too, is that they tend to hate delegating. It's important for them to have that hands-on control and direction of what happens around them, what takes place here. Founders of companies love their customers, Newt. And one of the things that they hate and rebel against is when the company gets bigger and larger and they get relegated to the boardroom. And you're surrounded by subordinates say, oh, we'll take care of that, sir. You know, in terms of understanding what our customers are thinking, we have all these great market surveys and they show charts. No, he wants to get down there in the company and work with it as well. I was just reading about the American modern art collector, Robert Scull, who in the 1960s was one of the pioneers in an interest in pop art, Jasper Johns and Andy Warhol. Scull became an enormously wealthy, enormously influential collector and became part of that creme de la creme of New York society, hanging out with the Guggenheims and the Rockefellers and the Hermans. But he had built his money in a taxi cab company. And so every morning, before he went out to go visit his friends at the Modern Museum of Art or go to cocktail parties in the West End, he would go down to his taxi cab company, go meet with the cab drivers, shake their hands, talk to them about what's happening with the company, what's taking place with all this. That whole scene from that old TV show, Taxi, you remember? There, with Judd Hirsch and the others, that was his environment. That's what he loved, even though he had one of the most successful taxi cab companies in the country. That he set up with it. So that willingness, that commitment to see what's happening, what's going on firsthand, the founders love that. Managers like to sort of delegate that to sort of say, pass that on to others. The fourth characteristic I'll mention here, Newt, which I think is important when we think about the founder that we have right now as president, is that they hate to delegate. They like to work with a small group of disciplined and loyal subordinates and partners. Here, they are people that they can trust, people who are loyal, who will carry out the vision and move that forward. And whether you're talking about John D. Rockefeller, or whether you're talking about Henry Ford, whether you're talking about Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, or whether you're talking about Donald Trump, who we remember, as I explain in the book, built his career as a founder in Manhattan real estate and built an empire in that era, breaking away from the tradition his father had had in Queens in terms of building housing and building instead high-rise hotels and apartment buildings. Trump, we see him conducting this war in Iran, for example, on Iran, and so on, this small, tight-knit group with whom he works, with whom he coordinates all his activities, Pete Hegseth at the War Department, Marco Rubio at the National Security Council and at the State Department, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff in the negotiations with the Iranians. That's how he operates. And it's infuriating to people who think that he should be listening to my voice because I have such great ideas. The president should respond to them. Why isn't he doing that? Well, that's how founders operate. They see a vision. They look for people who are going to carry out that vision and move forward to the end.
When we come back, we'll discuss why President Lincoln should be considered a founder in his own right. You make the case that Lincoln's a founder in his own right, but you have a quote. I don't think I'd ever seen this. You say Abraham Lincoln was a man aflame with the fire of genius, a phrase he coined in one of his least read and least understood speeches early in his career. What is the speech, and what did fire of genius mean in that context?
The speech is one about invention and about the importance of invention as a part of the American experience. And what he does is he fits the creation of the patent office, and he understood how important that was in terms of shaping the American experience and shaping American culture, and unique to the United States of America. That right of individuals and inventors to own their own property here. But he does it in a way that fits it within the course of not just American history, but world history, and of seeing this as an invention as important as the creation of language, as the creation of writing, as the creation of navigation and compasses, and the way in which the world of exploration had opened up for Europeans as a result of this. And what he says, that fire of genius that he's talking about, and of course, as a patent holder himself, he's thinking about this in terms of his own experience as an inventor, as someone with creative ideas, that for the first time in human history, Newt, we have a office, a patent office, which turns the human mind and human creativity into a source of wealth. Up until the 17th, 18th century, up until the Enlightenment, land was always seen as the main source of wealth. The landowning elite in any society were the wealthiest. Then came a realization, no, there's another source of wealth, which is commerce and trade. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is built around that idea that commerce and trade, the mobility of property, brings a new source of wealth and prosperity to societies. But at the same time, even with Smith, even with that view of commerce, you're still engaged in the exchange of goods and commodities that emerge from the earth, whether agricultural products or whether you're talking about mineral wealth or other ways in which we can commodify what it is we grow or draw out of the earth. What Lincoln was talking about was now that the next major source of wealth will be human creativity. What the mind can generate can now be a source of prosperity, not just for me as the patent holder, but for everyone who benefits from the inventions and from the technologies that I create, because I know that those are mine and mine alone, the rights to that technology. It's a huge breakthrough. And as I suggest in the book, it's probably as important as anything that Lincoln included in the Emancipation Proclamation in terms of representing a turning point, a moment of recognition of America's place in history, but also the recognition of what it is that America must hold as its most important identity and key. That is the ability to turn the human mind into a source of wealth and prosperity.
You make another point about Lincoln that's, I think, extraordinarily important, and that is that he really saw himself as an agent of God. As he put it, chosen by him to perform a great work. For a man who was in many ways rational and almost enlightenment, and as you point out, is oriented towards commerce far more than we think, that's an amazingly powerful statement. As he goes into a process which I think in the back of his mind, he always knows could potentially be a civil war.
It does. And I know you'll agree with me, seeing yourself in that role as an agent of God is both an incredible source of empowerment, but also an enormous source of responsibility. It means that what you do, the decisions you make, cannot be taken lightly, and that they have to be weighed in terms of these larger issues about good and evil, about redemption and salvation. You know, throughout the book, as you read through it, go through the chapters, and I talk about the founders, the issues of religion, the issues of God, and our relationship with God run all the way through these discussions and the people who are involved here in discussions. And this is true even before the founding fathers, who understood the degree to which what they were doing, the acts that they were taking were, in a sense, providential, what they were creating and the opportunity they were given them. And it goes back all the way to our old friends, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who understood that their arrival in the shores of America, that this, as one of them described it, this errand into the wilderness, had brought for them, on the one hand, the gift from God of being his chosen ones and being on a mission to discharge that. But at the same time, that being the agent of God demands enormous amounts of hard work. As I put it in the book, the Pilgrims and Puritans saw themselves as God's chosen, but not entitled. In other words, being chosen by God does not mean that you're going to have a cushy life and that things are going to come to you. You're going to have to work at it. You're going to be expected to dedicate your time and effort towards building that shining city upon a hill that they had set for themselves and that have remained, I believe, a goal for all of our best leaders and presidents going forward. I think also including our current one, too, that underlying everything that he is doing is a vision of what America has been and should be and can be again. And that is, I think, a link to what he shares with all of the major political leaders, but also at the same time, cultural leaders that have shaped in American history and who found in themselves that kind of founder's fire, that founder's mindset to go out, defy convention, defy criticism and opposition, and to say, no, I see a future here and I'm going to risk what I have now in order to achieve what's possible tomorrow.
You know, I think in this whole issue of being saved by God or being given a purpose, I think when Trump went through being shot, everybody realized it was providential, because if he had turned his head 1 second later, it would have gone through his brain. He'd have been dead. And then a couple weeks later, I talked to Speaker Mike Johnson about this. Johnson was down at Mar-a-Lago the day that the Secret Service came in and said they had just picked up a guy with a rifle on the golf course where Trump normally golfs. And apparently the second one really got through to him. He could sort of shrug off the first one as this kid who's crazy. But now when you have two of them, you suddenly realize there really are people who want me dead. Johnson told me that he and the president went off to a private room and literally spent about an hour praying. And I do think in that sense, in things like the Iranian war and other activities, President Trump has a deep sense that all of this relates to his having been saved by God. And he sort of said that in his inaugural address. Coming up, we'll talk about the 250th anniversary of the United States this July and what the next generation of founders may look like. You have this split, those trying to build something bigger and those focused on making money quickly. Do you think that's always been true?
I think that is. And that's not to put down people who are entrepreneurs who do want to make a lot of money and be successful. I understand that perfectly. That's a perfectly legitimate process. And in the process, then, too, one can generate a new business, a new product, a new technology, which can have enormous advantages for others in that regard. In fact, as you know, George Gilder would tell us that's what every entrepreneur is about, is in the end, is providing a gift. He provides gifts through his business, through his invention to others in which he has put himself out and put his money and put his time at risk in the hopes that others will benefit from what he's produced or what he's selling or what he's doing. And that's perfectly true. But I think there's also another level of entrepreneurship, which is, as I say, shaped by not just success in this world with a business or with an enterprise, but it has a vision that is linked to the future and not just to making money in the present, but thinking about how does my business, how does my invention change the lives of others for the better? And how can I fulfill that mission and pursue that in the best and in the most efficient way? And I think whether you're talking about John D. Rockefeller or whether you're talking about Henry Ford in particular, all of them saw what they were doing, what they were engaged in the oil business and the automobile business, Steve Jobs in the computer business. All of them saw what they were doing as something which would have a ripple effect throughout American society, even world society, in terms of creating a cheap source of energy. You know, those blue barrels of Standard Oil, you know, at a nickel a barrel. I mean, it's just extraordinary what cheap energy, how that can fuel and change and move society forward in powerful ways. The mobility to be gained with the Model T, first of all, available to the common person, to a normal family, a farmer's family, being able to afford an automobile that gives them instant mobility outside their community to go, to move goods, to move and carry their family to vacations, etc. Henry Ford understood that this was a transformation of American society through that, for the better, through the power of mobility here. And then, of course, someone like Steve Jobs, the same thing with regard to what a personal computer could do for transforming people's lives for the better and changing their relationship with information, their ability to connect. He didn't completely foresee what the internet would do in terms of creating that connectivity in the powerful ways that it has, for good and some for ill. All of that made possible by the fact that you can do it, if you like, the privacy of your own home through the computer screen. And then Elon Musk, who is also one of the, I think, important figures in the latter part of the book, for whom the vision of the electric vehicle that was originally part of his success with Tesla and the creation of this company, which was, as you remember, Newt, wildly celebrated by the left and by the liberal establishment of Tesla as being the automobile of the future, and Elon Musk as this sort of sainted figure as America moves away from fossil fuels to a clean energy future. And then who decides, you know what, this is really great, but I have my eyes on another vision, which is going into space. And not just going into space, but going to his particular destination, which is Mars. And then committing himself to making that vision happen and take place in the ways that SpaceX is now one of the foundational, not just for American technology in space and our space exploration, but also in a national security sense, too. The whole goal that Trump has and why he founded the Space Force in the beginning, the idea of American space dominance. Well, gee, SpaceX is an integral part of that vision of what space as the final frontier or the next frontier for American national security is all about. All of these things spring from the fact that you have a founder who sees the future, who moves in that kind of direction, and who's not afraid to really abandon his previous successful business in order to move forward into the future. That's a founder in action.
I actually think your model is very, very helpful. And I want to thank you for joining me today. Your new book, Founder's Fire, from 1776, The Age of Trump, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I think people would really be helped by coming to understand this whole notion of how to be a founder, what a founder is like, and why it's central to the American system. So, Arthur, you've done a very important contribution to our 250th anniversary, and I really appreciate you sharing time with us today.
Well, what I wanted this book to do, Newt, was I wanted to give people a new understanding of American business, the role of founders, a fresh understanding of American history, but also a new way to understand themselves. And people can ask themselves, maybe I'm a founder too, and I didn't realize it. Is that power, that creative fire, the fire of genius may lie within me and is waiting to be unleashed. And I hope that people will read it with that path to self-knowledge in mind.
Well, I encourage them to get the book, and I really think you've made a powerful case.
Thanks, Newt.
And now I'm pleased to introduce a new segment to Newt's World, where I answer listeners' questions. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. Inner Circle member John Fleming asked, in your book, To Save America, you presented methods to reduce healthcare fraud and waste. Are we making significant progress considering the Wisconsin issues are ongoing as well as others? The answer is no. The fact is, we have to profoundly rethink how we're doing the effort to stop fraud and waste. Coming out of COVID, there was so much money awash in the system. It was given away so sloppily that we basically encourage crooks. At one level, we have to say, if somebody's sitting out there and they're not very well off, and they suddenly realize that you can fill out a piece of paper and somebody will give you $30,000 for doing nothing, you're going to do it. The worst example was in California, where there was a $20 billion fraud of California state prison members, people in prison, who were using the California state prison computers for identity fraud and had friends on the outside picking up the checks, and they managed to steal $20 billion. This stuff is nuts, and we need a totally new, much more aggressive approach to it. And the key is not to go around trying to lock people afterwards. The key is to rethink the systems so it's very hard to be defrauded. And that's a very difficult challenge, but it's one of the biggest challenges because there are some estimates that we're losing as much as $500 billion a year to fraud. I look forward to hearing from you. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. Thank you to my guest, Arthur Herman. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.